I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of the Heartland. Today we're in Woodlawn Cemetery in Winona, where many of our family and friends and acquaintances from the past rest in peace. Many people look at it as only a place for the dead, perhaps even a ghoulish place, where you might visit only on Halloween. I prefer to think of it as a live place, a place where you can wander around and look at the headstones. Each one tells a story about the person buried here, the name and the date, and a message about the person. You could imagine that person for a while alive in another era. Today we're going to find out about the general history of this beautiful place and see it come alive again during the Woodlawn Cemetery Walk, sponsored by the Winona Historical Society. I'm standing now with Mark Peterson, the Executive Director of the Historical Society, and we're standing on what is known as probably the oldest area of the Woodlawn Cemetery, and this is where the very first person of the cemetery is buried. And I understand Scott Clark was buried here in 1854, where we stand right now, and he was buried actually before this was even a cemetery.
8 years before the cemetery had been established. He was the brother to George Clark, one of the very earliest pioneer settlers we had here in Winona, and this part of this was their property, and there was a house nearby, and as it was the tradition back in the early 1850s, and until we had a first cemetery, people often were buried right on their own property. In fact, the first efforts at establishing a cemetery in Winona was behind Sugarloaf, and it was often very wet, and people didn't think it was appropriate for a cemetery, and people were burying people in Central Park, where the post office is now. The records indicate that there were up to between 12 and 15 people buried there. And so as Winona was growing, Winona had been founded in the late fall of 1851, and by 1862, 11 years later, there was a definite need for a good cemetery, and Mr. Williams, along with some other leading citizens of Winona, formed the Woodlawn Cemetery Association. They purchased this area, this property here, almost right away. People were dug up and reburied over here in Woodlawn Cemetery, and it's for everybody.
The Cemetery Association over the years was able to acquire 220 acres of land, 55 of which are currently being used for 27,000 grave sites. 21,000 are currently occupied. 9 more acres are in reserve for later development, and the remaining land goes up the hillside, not suitable for burial, but adds to the serenity of the surroundings.
The Cemetery Association it's a private corporation that exists for the public good. They have a fund that helps maintain the grounds and the markers, and even John Latch, who's buried right behind us over there in one of the larger monuments, contributed money to the Woodlawn Cemetery Association in his will. The greatest philanthropist Winona's ever had, and just a remarkable individual.
Now, Mark, I know you have some real significant grave sites here, as well as significant people. Of course, they're all significant. But tell me a little bit more about the person that you have in the Revolutionary War grave.
There's only one known Revolutionary War veteran in the state of Minnesota, and that's here in Woodlawn Cemetery. Mm-hmm. It was a man by the name of Stephen Taylor. He came to Winona in the early 1850s, and he was in his 90s at the time. If you can imagine traveling across country and getting on a steamboat and coming up to Winona in the 1850s, and when this was really a pretty wild area, and be in your 90s to do it, I think is remarkable. He apparently came with his son, and they farmed outside of Winona, died on the farm, buried on the farm, and then later dug up and moved to a nearby cemetery. Daughters of the American Revolution got wind of this Revolutionary War veteran right here in Minnesota, and they decided he needed to be better recognized. And in the early 1930s, they completed a rather unique marker for him. They built a replica of Fort Ticonderoga around his grave site and embedded his marker in that.
We really do have a little bit of everybody buried in this cemetery, including the indigent of Winona, the people who had no money to bury themselves. The people I'm speaking about are the ones in Potter's Field. Let's talk a little bit about Potter's Field.
It's an area that wasn't maintained for a long time, and it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that the Cemetery Association has started maintaining it. And it sits on a hillside. There's scattered grave markers there. I think many of them either didn't have a marker or they had a wooden marker that has since deteriorated. But it was if somebody died, what do you do with them? The county, I think was responsible for dealing with it, and they would take them out here and they would bury them, and sometimes people later, family members would find the resources to erect a monument for them.
Mm-hmm. When you walk around this area, you don't really feel like it's a cemetery where it's a place to go visit the dead. It's more of a place to go revive memories and think about things and bring back the life of these people. That's the way I feel about it.
That certainly is true, I think, particularly in light of what the Historical Society's been doing the last 6 years with our Voices from the Past Woodlawn Cemetery Discovery Walk. And what we have done each year in the middle of October, the prettiest time of the year to be in the cemetery when the fall colors usually are at their peak, is we do bring approximately 8 to 9 different people alive for that time.
This is the gravesite of John and Hannah Lowell. I want to welcome you to this, the first burial site of Woodlawn Cemetery. Oh, well, that's after it officially became a cemetery. There's a man named Mr. Clark that's up toward the gate, and he'll be telling you that he was the first one buried here. Mm-hmm. Well, he's right, but that was before Woodlawn Cemetery was created. Just don't want you to get confused about that. I was born in 1817 in Pennsylvania, and shortly thereafter my folks moved to Butler County.
And that's where you met Mother.
Oh, Hannah, my sweet Hannah. What a marvelous woman she was. We had 5 children together. And during those early years of family life, I was a businessman of some success, I might say. In fact, at one point, we moved to Clarion County because of that.
That's right, and you were a judge there for the county. He was very highly respected there, being a judge.
Well, in 1857, we heard of a little town, a bustling town.
Little town.
Yeah, out west. It was called Winona.
Dad was an attorney while we were in Winona, and a businessman. He was very well thought of here. He was a good dad to us, and a kind and caring husband to Mother.
We were also members of the First Presbyterian Church, where I taught Sabbath school for probably people a couple years younger than you.
And he sang.
Oh yes, loved to sing. Mine eyes have seen the
His voice could be heard ring out with a Joyce song every week. Friends and neighbors alike knew he could be counted on if they ever needed any help.
Sadly, though, my life here in Winona lasted only 5 years. I contracted typhoid fever because the water was not safe and clean as it is now.
That's right. Dad suffered with typhoid fever for 12 long weeks.
And I thought of all I was missing at only 45 years of age, especially my daughter Lissy's wedding. She was just a couple years older than you folks are, and she was getting married to Oliver Jones, the son of the very good friends who came with us from Pennsylvania.
Oliver later founded Jones and Krueger Company, J&K, and my sister Euphemia married Edwin Bogart, who later became Winona County Sheriff.
My sweet Hannah joined me here at Woodlawn Cemetery. She died when she was only 44.
Mother had 29 teeth extracted. That's right, 29 teeth extracted by Dr. T.B. Welch in preparation for some false teeth he created. He had used chloroform to perform the extractions, and then he sent her home afterwards. Almost immediately, she broke out in chills and spasms. Poor Mother. Death came as a relief to her, but we were all devastated.
Probably the only blessing in the midst of that devastation in the family was the fact that she did not have to witness the trial.
It was a blessing neither of you had to witness the trial. What my father was referring to was a disaster and a humiliation in my life.
My son, Ben, had become enamored with the pretty young daughter of the Elys.
We had spent quite a bit of time together. We were neighbors and had known each other for years. I admit she was charming, and I was smitten with her, but she left town to become an actress. I later heard she was engaged to a gentleman in Chicago, so at that time I decided to go on with my life and concentrated on my business.
But then she came back and you began seeing each other again.
Yeah, and at that time I received an offer of a position in Mankato. Decided to take it too. But when I arrived to Mankato, I was arrested and brought back to Winona. Hattie Ely had accused me of promising to marry her and leading her on.
Adding insult to injury was that all of the proceedings were in every paper in town.
It was awful. People crowded into the courtroom. All these terrible things were said. Neither Hattie nor I could ever hold our heads up in town again. We finally settled the matter, and I left town.
I understand that Hattie married another man shortly thereafter and
correct.
moved out west too.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's good your mother didn't have to witness that.
Well, I'm so very sorry, Father, but at least the shame was mine only. The esteem in which the community held you and Mother was such that your reputation could not be blighted by such a sordid event.
Son, you were an honorable man and you led a good life. Perfection doesn't exist in anyone's life. Why should yours be any different?
I guess that's true, Pa. Thanks.
The trial was big news in the 1880s, and the two families involved, the Lowes and the Elys, were both devastated. Thanks to the cemetery walk, we can now listen to the Ely side of the story. This is Helen Ely Williamson, and this is Harriet Ely Moltzner, who we call her Hattie. I am Jane Ely. My husband and I were some of the very earliest settlers here in Winona, and what an adventure that was. We arrived in Winona in 1852.
We hear that the Baptist church that he helped found just celebrated its 150th anniversary. Father would have been so proud.
Did you know that Father was the first postman here?
That's true, but the post office consisted of his hat, because that's where he kept the mail.
Mother was also very influential. There were few families who didn't have one of Mother's beautiful portraits.
It's true, I did enjoy my painting. However, more important to me than my artwork was the education of my children. Education was very important to both Edward and I, and that's why we founded schools and I taught in them.
Mother inspired me to teach and to eventually attend the University of Minnesota.
She was the only girl in her class and the first woman to graduate from the university. Talk about pioneer spirit.
And Hattie was always a restless child.
I wanted something different.
Then she proceeded to the stage. Not a vocation considered very suitable for a young woman.
But I was hired to perform. I was paid $15 a week with a traveling troupe. Well, we did have chaperones and all. It was very exciting. I even got to play a boy boxer in one of the plays. While in Chicago, I became engaged to Mr. Potter, whom I thought was a decent man, but he sure wasn't. Decided he didn't want to marry an actress, is what I think.
Well, we knew that Hattie had a long-time friendship with a young man down the block, Ben Lowe. And Ben Lowe was much older than she was, but he was an upstanding young man of business.
They became very attentive to each other until suddenly Ben took a job in Mankato and prepared to leave.
Well, then we were absolutely shocked when Hattie told us that he had promised to marry her.
That's right. It wasn't right that he should just be able to take off after leading me on and making promises. I didn't think he should just be able to take off. So I filed charges against him.
Well, he was arrested in Mankato, and a terrible trial took place after that. We were just absolutely humiliated by all the gossip and the unkind things that people said about our dear, sweet daughter.
Well, after only a few days, the trial was settled, and I was well rid of that man.
Well, my high-spirited daughter did finally settle down with a fine young man, Charles Moltzner, and they married, and they had a family, and they moved off to Montana. When Hattie left, Helen married Henry Williamson, and they moved on to Portland, Oregon, where they raised their family. And my husband and I, Edward, we moved on to the Dakota Territory, and he died in 1887. But 2 years later, we brought his remains right back here. Here's his gravestone. It's the only one here in the cemetery that says Ely on it. Jane Ely died 25 years later in 1912 in Portland, Oregon. Around that same time, William Laird, the lumber baron of Winona, also died. He's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. He, like the Elys, arrived in Winona in the 1850s.
My name is William Harris Laird. They used to call me W.H. I'm here to tell you about lumber, lots of it. And I'd like to introduce you now to my cousin Matthew Norton and his charming wife Emma.
I'm Matthew Norton, and I'm one of the founders of the company, Laird Norton Company. And that company started way back. Before I got here, it was just the Laird Company, and it was started in 1855, 150 years ago. And it still exists today. Now it has a different name. It is now known as UBC.
And there's still a great deal of family involvement in the business.
My brothers and I had pooled our resources and purchased some lumber. We invited our cousins to take part of it.
WH's business plan was to buy a lot of lumber, cheaply float it down the river in a raft, get it to Winona, and there he started a lumber yard on Franklin Street by the levee. Sales were good, business was brisk, things were looking up for you, WH.
So when they arrived here in 1856, we formed a partnership, Laird Norton and Company. By the end of the year, we were by far the largest lumber company in the town.
And there were lots of other lumber dealers right then. There were about 10 of them in Winona. But eventually we continued to buy them out one by one, and then we solidified our position by building a sawmill.
I mean, yes, Winona was a bustling village, and I was very impressed with the lumber yards and everything, but it couldn't have been more different than Philadelphia.
In 1868, we took a big step forward. We purchased a 640-acre tract of pine land by the Chippewa River. We bought the land for only $5 an acre.
It was so important to have land next to the river and so many trees as well, because we could float it down, and it was estimated that there were over 6 million board feet. That's a lot of lumber to sell.
It was a good decision, and 2 years later, we bought more land. My wife Mary and our children were very involved in the First Congregational Church here.
Had his own pew, in fact. Emma and I were involved in the Methodist Church back in Pennsylvania, and when we moved to Winona, we also stayed involved with the Methodist Church, and downtown Winona on Broadway is the church that we supported and donated to, Central Methodist Church.
We donated liberally to build the Central Methodist Church. And even today, it's still one of the largest and finest churches in the state.
I'm surprised you haven't talked about your favorite yet. Why don't you tell the kids about the library?
It's our pride and joy, I'll have you know. One of my relatives from Pennsylvania, Warren Powers Laird, was the architect. Brick walls covered with stone. Winona stone entry and columns of Georgia marble.
It was a masterpiece, WH, a real treasure.
One of the things that we felt very proud about was the fact that we could work together as family members. Now, a lot of companies started out as family members but soon broke up and split apart because they couldn't get along. But it was something that we are proud of, that we could get together, work together, and make it a financial as well as a emotional success.
While the Laird Norton family was being established in Winona, another family consisting of two brothers, German immigrants Fred and John Malke, were establishing themselves as bakers. Dave Malke plays the part of his grandfather, as he and the actor who portrays Ernest Blado bring Winona's bakery story to life.
My name is Ernest Blado, and this is my former employer and my mentor, John Malke.
Ernest. And this young man over here is my grandson, David Malke.
I sure wish I could offer you a donut.
My father and mother had heard that there was opportunity here. So my father and mother and Fred and the other kids and I came to America and made our way to Winona, Minnesota. A business opportunity came up for us. we had the chance to buy the Winona the Winona Baking Company down on West 5th Street. We bought it, we changed the name, and called our company the Winona Fancy Bakery.
The bakery at that time was in a building 20 feet by 50 feet, and they put out about 250 loaves of bread a day. Now there were 10 bakeries operating in Winona at that time. By the time I came to work for John and your uncles, their bakery had grown considerably.
Yes, it had, and it wasn't done growing. In our heyday, we had 2 retail bakery locations in Winona. We had a fleet of 6 delivery trucks, 30 employees, and a whopping payroll of $75,000 a year. At that point, we were putting out 4,500 loaves of bread a day. But when we started out, we were peddling our goods door to door in a horse-drawn wagon.
Ernest Blado worked for the Malkys as a young man, and in 1924 he and his wife Mary began their own bakery, which is still in operation at 451 East Broadway. His daughter Mildred married Julius Skirnus. They took over the operation until 1984, when they sold it to their son, Ernest, and his wife Darlene. They in turn ran Blado's until January of 2004.
People would line up at the door, and you know, it makes me wonder if today these office meetings that are held, I wonder if they could be held without Blado's Donuts. I think if they had to, there'd be a revolt.
That's right, and you know, as Blado's Bakery was thriving, Mildred, so was Malky's Bakery under my sons and Clara. But unfortunately, when they decided to retire, these youngsters were not wanting to take over the business.
Well, we might have done it. We had new ideas, wanted to make some changes, but Pa said, Grandpa didn't do it that way, and neither will we. Besides, I wanted to go into education.
David, that's a noble profession also. You're a school principal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Pa wouldn't talk to me for 6 months when he found out I wasn't going to do the bakery.
And Julius and my boys went on different paths also. They went into law and business and other occupations. But Ernest, who was named after you, decided he would take over the bakery, and he did that with his wife Darlene, and they ran it up until last year. Now Julius and I went down the river, and we had a lovely home there, and we like to dance and play cards a little bit.
You know, when our bakery closed, we sold all of the equipment and most everything else to the new Federal Bakery in town. But we saved one thing, the best thing we had, and sold it to the Blados. Our recipes. Things like kitchen bread, Wiedemann bread, Heidelberg rye, oatmeal cookies.
Oh, and those baked goods will continue to tempt Winonans and visitors alike for years to come. And the couple that bought the bakery, they're the Polisers, they've agreed, they've vowed to keep all the same recipes. So it's a pretty delicious thought. For years and years to come, our bakery goods will live on, and they will influence our children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. I think we've left a pretty sweet impression on this community.
It's not only educational, it's entertaining, but it's an important thing, I think, to sort of recognize that this cemetery is here, and its beauty, and its the stories. There's over 20,000 people buried here, and every one of them has a story to tell. So we could be doing the cemetery walk forever.
Now, I understand that you know quite a bit about the symbolism on the gravestones. Tell me what you know about that.
Scattered throughout the cemetery here, there are a variety of gravestones, and they're oftentimes adorned with some kind of a symbol. A lot of times it's hands that are clasped, or a small lamb, often a symbol used for small children. You'll see a lot of fraternal symbols on many of the grave markers also. The idea of belonging to a fraternity was very popular, particularly in the 19th century. There was just all kinds of associations that you could belong to. Most men belonged to one or another, or they had a place to socialize, and so you'll see those kind of symbols.
Sure.
The Masons are obvious.
Now, if you were to pick a symbol for yourself, what would it be?
Well, I'm not going to have a symbol, but I'm going to have an epithet.
Okay, what's it going to say?
Well, right now, it could change because I don't plan on checking out for a while. But right now, I love epitaphs, and I like cemeteries. And as you're walking around cemeteries, someday I want somebody to say, "Hey, come here, look at this one," and it'll be my epitaph right now. I hope says, "Now I'm history." So I think it would be appropriate.
Yeah, you definitely are the man of history here.
Well, no, someday I'll be history, and so that's what I'll probably put on my headstone.
Good idea. We're standing at the gravesite of the oldest person buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. This is Stephen Taylor, who was born in 1757. He fought in the Revolutionary War and died in 1857. Thanks for joining me today here at this gorgeous Woodlawn Cemetery, where you can come not only to take a wonderful walk, visit with some old friends, and certainly learn a lot about history. I'm Joyce Woodworth. Please join me again next week. Till then, enjoy the spirit of the Heartland. Hello, this is Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of the Heartland. The Woodlawn Cemetery Walk, sponsored by the Historical Society in Winona, Minnesota, is held each year in the fall. During this time, students from the area schools and the public walk the brick paths of this beautiful hillside cemetery to view grave sites dated back to 1854. The monuments over the graves are primarily granite, designed and carved by stonecutters to last for eternity. Many of them are works of art, and for the people who wander the cemetery, it's like walking through an outdoor art museum. The art pieces are scattered amongst beautiful trees, and the cemetery itself contains practically every single type of tree that can be grown in the northern part of our country, making it not only an outdoor art museum, but an arboretum as well. Intertwined amongst the beauty of the park-like atmosphere and the stones carved by skillful artisans are the stories of the people who lie and rest in this remarkable cemetery. Once a year, we are privileged to hear several of the stories brought back to life through actors who portray the people buried here. In the first part of the Spirit of the Heartland show on the Woodlawn Cemetery Walk, we learned about the Laird Norton, Blado Malky, Ely, and Lowe families. In today's show, we'll learn of 4 more families, all prominent in Winona's history.
Well, first of all, my name is Carrie Peters Gage, and I was born in a place called Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine, when I was born, was in France, so then I was French. But by the time I left in 1878, it was in Germany, so then I was German. But I decided with so much political unrest over there after the Franco-Prussian War that I would make a new life for myself. And I thought America sounded like a place I could go where there would be lots and lots of opportunities. So at the age of 16, I left home and I came to Winona, Minnesota. I immediately was able to get work, which would be unheard of in Alsace-Lorraine, and I became a hat maker, a milliner. And I worked for the Hess brothers on 3rd Street. They had a shop called the French Millinery Shop, and it was the best in town. We made the most beautiful hats. Our clientele knew that the hats that they were getting were going to be every bit as good as those in New York or Paris, and they were distinguished by the hats that they wore from the French Millinery Company. We were on 3rd Street, East 3rd Street, and I've been told that I would not recognize the building since there's something in there now called a fitness center. I can't imagine what that would be, but that's what's there. Anyway, I worked very, very hard for the Hess brothers, worked my way up in the business, and I became manager. After working very hard for 6 years, I was able to send for my family in Alsace-Lorraine, and they came and joined me in Winona. My beloved mother, Caroline, I was named for her, Caroline, but we always called me Carrie so that we wouldn't get us mixed up, you know. And my stepfather, Jacob, and my stepsister, Josie, and I had 2 stepbrothers, Jake and Alphonse. Anyway, my stepfather and my sister, Josie, were able to get jobs with me at the millinery shop. And we lived quite well, actually. After a while, I was able to buy my own business. And in fact, I bought my own building. It was at 115 East 3rd Street. And I'm told now that there is a very, very nice music shop in there called Hearts Music? Hearts? I think that's it. But anyway, it's a beautiful building. There's a little balcony on the 2nd floor overlooking the street. And I used to sit up there in the evenings. Oh, I lived upstairs. Did I tell you that? I lived upstairs, and I would sit on my balcony, and I would look over the street after work, and I would think what a wonderful life I had in America. And you know, it never occurred to me that I would marry. But then I met Stephen Gage, and we were both a little long in the tooth, 2 years over the age of 30, rather late to be marrying in those days. But we did get married, and we were both very good Catholics, and we were married by Bishop Cotter in his rectory. And we settled down and wanted to look forward to a nice long life together. And Stephen was a conductor on the Green Bay and Western Railroad. One day in 1895, near Arcadia, he slipped, and he fell under a moving car, and it severed his legs. And they tell me that he died of shock in less than 15 minutes. But I still had my family and my business, so I went on and thought, well, Carrie, you never know what life throws you. And I worked very hard, but we had a very sad couple of years. I lost my dear mother, then I lost my stepfather as well. My sister Josie moved to New York, and my brother Alphonse moved to Chicago. Oh well, I did have a very wide circle of friends, and I volunteered in the community, and I volunteered for my church, and I really was very, very happy, you know, after the initial grief was over. And I lived for, quite a while, but I had to retire at the age of 51 because of ill health. Well, ill health didn't hold me back. I lived another 30 years and didn't die until 1946 at the age of 81. Oh Oh, well.
Carrie Gage was an exceptional woman for her time with a business of her own. Coincidentally, this year's cemetery walk brought out another independent woman from the same time frame, Emma Shelton, played by Angie Scott. 2 years younger than Carrie Gage and much in common with her, including a husband who worked for the railroad and a woman of independent means.
My name is Emma Shelton, and in 1914 I opened the first beauty salon in Winona, Minnesota. I offered 5 kinds of waves and a rainwater rinse with every shampoo. I demonstrated my expertise in hair care by going door to door with a satchel full of shampoos and lotions for sale. I catered to women from all walks of life, from the wealthy and elite, all the way to the women that worked in the houses of ill repute. I employed 3 beauticians, a masseuse, and lots of the high school girls worked for me part-time in my shop. In 1935, I took a class in chiropody, and I added foot services at my salon. I was particularly known for my skill at trimming corns and calluses. Now, you might wonder, how did a woman of color like me come to own a business in Winona, Minnesota? Let me tell you a little bit about my life. I started out in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1865, where I was born. My mother was black, and my father was half black, a quarter Irish, and a quarter Cherokee. My mother and I worked too. My mother and I worked at the maternity hospital in the restaurant. That was hard work. But I always said my whole life that if you don't fit in, you just have to wiggle a little harder until you make some space. By 1900, things were even worse for blacks in the South. We had little ability to vote, and we had very little access to public facilities. So in 1902, when I married my husband Virgil, I was glad that he had a job in the North. He had a good job in the North, in fact. He was a porter on the train in Winona, Minnesota. And 3 days after we got married, we moved to Winona. Now, we weren't the first black folks here. In fact, there were 22 by the time they took the census in 1910. One of those people of African descent who are already here was our good friend James Stovall. He came in 1877 and he started a restaurant. He was a good friend to us when we came to town. And in 1905, when he retired, he sold us that restaurant and we operated it until 1911. In 1911, we sold the restaurant and I went to beauty school in Chicago, Illinois. When I came back, I started doing hair in women's homes. I did shampoos and styles there. But when I opened my salon, the women were loyal to me and they came and got their hair done in the salon. Now, I had high standards for the people that worked for me. They had to be courteous and well-behaved and well-mannered every time the shop was open. Sometimes the girls who carried those buckets of rainwater up from the basement complained because they were heavy. But those rainwater rinses were very popular with our customers. Now, I'm proud that I was the first African-American woman to own a business here in Winona, but I'm also proud of my family. My husband and I had one son, his name was Larkin, and we had a big surprise on June the 18th, 1914. On our doorstep that evening, we found a 6-month-old baby girl. She had a note pinned to her blanket that said if we didn't want to keep her, we could leave her at the post office steps at midnight. Not keep that beautiful baby girl? Of course we kept her. We named her Grace, and the community loved her and loved her story. They gave her lots of beautiful gifts, including a carriage. We adopted 2 more girls in later years, one named Gertrude and one named Dorothy. Now, a few years after that, in 1919, our good friend James Stovall died, and I helped take care of him while he was ill. When he passed away, he didn't have any family, and so he left me the property that he owned on 2nd Street. And I rented that property for a laundry, for a second-hand store, and for apartments. My family and I lived over the beauty shop. When we lived over the beauty shop, I was able to go right downstairs and take care of my customers. My husband Virgil died in 1932, but I remained active in our community, and the community accepted me. And race didn't keep me from being involved. I was an active member of Central Methodist Church. After Virgil died in 1932, that was the Depression, and those were really hard times. But I kept going and did really well. People continued to be faithful and come to my shop. In 1941, I retired. My business had flourished here for many years. So in 1941, I retired, and in 1951, I moved up here with Virgil. At my funeral, the preacher said, he quoted from chapter 14 in the Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus talked about the woman who took care of Jesus' feet, Jesus said, "Why do you trouble this woman? She has done a beautiful service for me." And I guess that's how I want to be remembered, as doing a service for the women who lived here in Winona. Thanks for coming up to visit with me today.
By the time Carrie Gage and Emma Shelton arrived in Winona, Hannibal Choate's dry goods store was well established. Hannibal, originally from New York, purchased his store in Winona for $900 in 1861. Hannibal, portrayed by Phil Fighton, his sister Louise, portrayed by Linda Brzezinski, and his grandson Harris, or Cokie, portrayed by Brandon Sharmer, describe what happened to that store.
Grandpa, tell them how you almost lost your first store in that big fire.
Oh, that was a frightening day. It was the 4th of July in 1862. I had hardly been in town for a year. Well, it seemed some of the boys had a little extra celebration for the holiday, and a big fire started downtown. Burned down all of the buildings in the downtown area except one. That was my store on Main Street. Fire didn't stop that.
The old rumor has it that Grandpa here knew water wasn't the only thing that could put out fires. He offered the firefighters inspiration in the form of spirits, and that is why his store was saved.
Well, you do what you got to do. I had a pail with some bottles in underneath one of the counters, and I kind of made them available.
Hannibal's clever handling of this building during the infamous fire of 1862 helped his business flourish, and 25 years later, his success as a businessman afforded him the opportunity to build one of the grandest buildings in Winona for that time as well as today.
We had a couple of models at our store. All we ask is comparison between our goods and whatever else was available. But the other model, and the one that we really live by the most, no goods misrepresented at H. Choate & Company. That was fair merchandise at good price for the customers. And we built our business on that in the business group.
Yes, one of the things I most admired about my brother was his clever business sense. For example, he was one of the first to pioneer a fixed price system of goods. Before, you used to have to negotiate with the store owner as to what price you'd pay. But Hannibal would put price tags on the items, so everyone would know what it would cost and everyone would pay the same price. And he had a really clever way of advertising. He would post signs on the way into town, 8 miles to Choate's, and 7 miles to Choate's, and so on. And that would bring the people in.
Grandpa was much loved by the community, and especially by his employees. He gave each and every one of his employees a $1,000 life insurance policy their first year working for him.
Well, that's true. I believe that you wanted and needed to treat your employees with respect and kindness. And you know, they became loyal into the business and very good, productive employees.
He was also one of the first to recognize that ready-made clothes were the wave of the future.
Well, a lot of people didn't agree with that at those times, but if you look around, you're all wearing store-bought clothes. One of the things that made our business successful. Harriet and I had 3 children, Caroline, the daughter, and then 2 sons, Hannibal Jr. and Charles.
My father.
And your father was a good businessman, too. He followed in my footsteps. Tell them about the radio program, the Choate Musical Flock.
Well, it was aired on KWNO, and it was from 8 to 8:30 every morning.
Started in 1939, the day after the radio station first went on the air. But you know, your dad and Hannibal, they took the business over after I retired. I'd been 60 years in the business, and they kept up the policy of good merchandise at fair prices, good treatment to the employees and to the customers. And your dad was a good leader. He had a certain marketing creativity.
I used to love greeting the customers too. And since I love photography, I took pictures of everything and everybody.
Most of the time he didn't have any film in the camera.
That's okay. People liked having their pictures taken.
Koki Choate was a well-known character who was seen in the Choate store every day. He was a very kind, sensitive man who wandered the store and talked with everyone. One could not go in for a purchase without talking to Koki.
Say, Grandpa, we haven't mentioned the elevator in the store.
The first one in the whole area. The whole building was magnificent. It was stone with beautiful woodwork and a view of the river from all 5 floors. And it had a sprinkler system. I told you Hannibal was clever. He had learned his lesson after that first fire. Though I didn't agree when you started that fire in the basement to test it out.
Had to make sure it would work. I did build a little bonfire in the corner. And within 10 minutes, that sprinkler system went off. I got all wet, but the fire got put out, and I felt good that I wasn't going to lose that building to a fire if it ever happened. That was one of the good things. But you know, that building was my passion and my joy. It provided a place for the workers and my family to earn a living, a place for the Winona people to come and shop, get good merchandise at fair prices. And as you pointed out, it was a well-made building. It had plate glass windows, had fine marble pillars out in front. You can see them today if you go down there. Had oak woodwork throughout. It had fine brick and stone. The entire building was a showplace and a real anchor for the downtown business area. I'm glad to say that the people that took it over, the Hardard family, they did a good job in restoring. They brought it back to what it originally was, and they've got a retail store there too.
It's on the National Historic Registry.
Another honor for the old store on the corner.
And the beautiful home we lived in on 5th Street, that too has been wonderfully restored.
Ah, yes. A lovely young businesswoman named Julie Pendleton lives there now.
We had some good times in that home. Every couple of years we'd have some dinner parties that we'd invite the local people who were well known in the area, like the Lucases and the Lairds and the Nortons. Watkins and
Mr. Huff.
Mr. Huff came. And we're pleased that you all came to hear about the old store in the corner and to share those memories with us.
Yes, and the next time you find yourself in downtown Winona on the corner of 3rd and Center, stop and really look at the H. Choate & Company building. It would please us greatly.
Over 60 years in business. That's a record that is very rare, and one this community can be proud of. Thank you, Grandpa.
Folks, thank you all for coming. Now, are there any questions? If not, before you leave, Koki wants to take a picture with you.
In the same year the original Choate store was open, Julius Eby was born in Winona. Ellen Aspen portrays him and tells us his story.
When my father moved to America, he settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That's where he met my mother. In 1860, they moved to Winona. On the corner of 3rd and Lafayette Street, he opened a saloon. Now, as a boy, I would spend most of my time down next to the river, waiting for the big paddle wheeler to come up and down the river. And when they'd dock, I'd go on board. And I'd try to sell the passengers apples and assorted fruit. Now, I'd get their pennies, and I'd get their nickels. But every now and then I would get a shiny silver dime, and that was really something for a boy my age. Now, my father, he decided he wanted to try something different, so we moved out to Wilson Township. Next to the town of Wilson, he purchased a farm. But by 1882, he decided he didn't want to be a farmer anymore. So we moved back to Winona. And at 700 West 5th Street, he bought another building. And in that building, he put a grocery store, another saloon, and out back, he put a beer garden. and he called that building Evie's Corner. Now my father passed away in 1886, and I took over his establishment and I left it pretty much the same way it was, except I added an ice cream parlor to it, and I called that part the Palm Garden. About the same time I took over, Winona was really growing. There was people coming from all over Europe. They were coming from Germany. They were coming from Poland, Italy, and Russia. They were coming for the factory work, but a lot of them were coming for the sawmill work. Now this sawmill work was thirsty work. And a lot of those thirsty workers come by my place when the day was over. In 1925, I decided to retire. I sold Ernest Prost, so the name stayed the same, Evie's Corner. He later sold to Herbert Bragg, whose wife's name was Evelyn. So again, the name stayed the same. Later, it went to Ernie Brosey. And lastly, it was sold to Frank Briza, whose wife's name also was Evelyn. So through 6 different ownerships, the name stayed the same, Evie's Corner. Well, in 1935, I left Winona, and I moved in right here. And if you look around, if you got to go someplace, this is an awful pretty place to end up.
The Woodlawn Cemetery Walk is held once a year in the month of October. It is a wonderful opportunity for us to learn not only about Winona's history, but also see this beautiful outdoor art museum and arboretum. Many people work countless hours to bring out the stories of people from our past. Mark Peterson, director of the Winona Historical Society, sponsor of this event, is just one of them. Well, Mark, thank you once again for bringing the cemetery back to life for us.
Oh, well, it's fun. It's anytime is nice to be out here, but especially when the sun's shining.
And thank you, too, for joining us today. Please join me again next week. Till then, enjoy the spirit of the Heartland.